He's threatening city workers! That's what this HOA Karen screamed into her phone standing on my doorstep after completely failing to break into my house. I couldn't believe it. She'd just spent 30 minutes destroying my property with broken keys, and now she was calling 911 on me. My hands were shaking with pure rage as 18 neighbors recorded everything. This woman was making a false police report right in front of witnesses, trying to weaponize law enforcement against her own victim. But she had no idea who was about to respond to her emergency call. Comment if you've dealt with fake authority. This gets insane. You know that feeling when something seems off but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly what I felt when I first saw Charlotte Williams walking up my driveway. I was just finishing watering Margaret's memorial garden, the small patch of roses I planted after my wife passed last year. Nothing fancy, just a quiet spot where I could feel close to her memory. Then I heard it. Rattle, rattle, rattle. Keys. Lots of keys. More keys than any normal person should ever carry, jingling together like wind chimes in a storm. I looked up from the roses to see this woman marching toward me with the confidence of someone who owned the place. Clipboard in one hand, some kind of official-looking badge hanging from her neck, and that massive key ring making enough noise to wake the dead. "Good afternoon," she said, not waiting for me to respond. "I'm Charlotte Williams from the Homeowners Association. Time for your quarterly inspection." Now here is the thing: I have lived in plenty of neighborhoods over my 65 years, and I know what a real HOA looks like. This wasn't it. Our little street on Oak Ridge Drive had always been pretty informal. Neighbors helped neighbors, we kept our lawns decent, and nobody bothered anybody about paint colors or fence heights. But Charlotte, she had that clipboard confidence, you know what I mean? The kind of authority that comes from having official-looking paperwork and zero doubt about your right to use it. "I have master access to all community properties," she announced, already walking toward my front door. The way she said it, like she was doing me a favor by showing up unannounced. I should have trusted my gut right then. Should have asked to see some documentation, maybe called a neighbor to verify. But here's what gets you. When someone shows up with a badge and a clipboard acting like they belong, your brain kind of defaults to cooperation mode, especially when you're a widower in your 60s who just wants to tend his roses in peace. She pulled out that key ring, and man, it was something to behold. Had to be 15 or 20 keys on there, all different shapes and sizes. Some looked like standard house keys. Others were those thick deadbolt keys, and a few I couldn't even identify. Charlotte held them up like a trophy. "Master key system for all community properties," she said, sorting through them with practiced efficiency. "Let's start with your front door security check." I watched her select the first key, a brass one that looked pretty standard. She walked right up to my door like she'd done this 1,000 times before. And that's when everything started to fall apart. The key wouldn't even go into the lock. Not even close. Wrong size, wrong shape, wrong everything. Charlotte frowned, tried to force it, then pulled back and selected another key. This one was too big entirely. By now, Betty Wilson from next door had come out to water her plants, but I could tell she was really watching the show. Charlotte tried a third key, and this is where things got interesting in the worst possible way. Snap. The key broke, clean in half. The metal just gave up and split, leaving half of it sticking out of my lock and the other half in Charlotte's hand. For a moment, and I swear this is true, everything went completely silent. The birds stopped chirping, the distant traffic noise faded, even Charlotte's constant key rattling stopped. It was like the universe itself was taking a moment to process what just happened. Charlotte stared at the broken key in her palm, her face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that looked almost like panic. "This is impossible," she muttered loud enough for Betty and me to hear. "These are official master keys." She was trying to sound authoritative, but I could hear the uncertainty creeping in. The kind of wobble in someone's voice when their perfect plan hits its first real snag. But here's where Charlotte showed her true colors. Instead of admitting something might be wrong, she doubled down, marched straight over to my mailbox and tried the same broken key on the mailbox lock. And wouldn't you know it, worked perfectly. The mailbox popped right open like it was designed for that exact key. Charlotte turned back to me and Betty with this triumphant look. "See, the keys work fine. Your front door lock must be illegally modified." She said it with such conviction, such absolute certainty that for a second I almost believed her. Almost. But then my engineering brain kicked in. Mailbox locks and house locks aren't the same thing. Never have been. The Postal Service has their own key system completely separate from anything a homeowner would install. Any real housing authority would know that basic fact. Charlotte either didn't know, or she was betting that I didn't know. Either way, red flags were starting to wave in my mind. I was about to say something when my phone buzzed. Voice message from my son Daniel. "Hey Dad, just wanted to let you know I'm working patrol shifts in your area this weekend. Everything okay with the new neighbors?" Daniel's a good kid. Well, 34 years old now, but still my kid. Always checking in, making sure his old man is doing all right since Margaret passed. I didn't mention the Charlotte situation in my reply text. Honestly, it still seemed like maybe just a misunderstanding. Maybe she really was from some kind of housing authority and just had the wrong information. Maybe I was being paranoid. You know how it is when you're older. Sometimes you second-guess yourself when you should trust your instincts instead. I texted back, "All good here, son. Just dealing with a neighbor situation. Nothing serious." How wrong I was about the nothing serious part. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have called Daniel immediately. Would have asked him to swing by in his patrol car just to check things out. But hindsight's 20/20, right? Charlotte spent another few minutes trying to look official, taking notes on her clipboard and muttering about compliance issues and security violations. She took a selfie with the broken key still hanging from my lock, typing furiously on her phone. I caught a glimpse of what she was writing. Successful compliance check, some residents need education. The emoji at the end was flexed bicep, like she'd just accomplished something difficult. That should have been another red flag. What kind of professional housing inspector posts selfies with emoji about their work? But the real kicker came when she was walking away. Her phone screen lit up with a message notification, and even from 10 feet away, I could see the recipient name Jake Sullivan, Phase 1 complete. Phase 1 of what and who was Jake Sullivan? I had no idea then, but those two details, that text message and that broken key still hanging from my lock, were about to become the first pieces of evidence in a case that would rock our entire neighborhood. Sometimes the smallest details are the ones that bring down the biggest lies. The next morning, sunlight cut a clean line across my kitchen table and flashed off metal outside. The sound came first as a bright clink, then a steady jingle riding up the street. Charlotte was back, shoulders squared and tempo set like she had something to prove. Through my kitchen window, I could see her marching up the street with what looked like an entirely different keyring. This one was massive. Had to be 15 or 20 keys hanging from it, making enough noise to announce her arrival 3 houses away. She wasn't alone either. Betty Wilson was already outside, and I could see Mrs. Clark from across the street peeking through her curtains. Word travels fast in small neighborhoods, especially when someone breaks a key in your front door and leaves it hanging there like some kind of bizarre decoration. I tried to remove the broken key myself yesterday evening, but it was stuck good. Part of me was curious to see how Charlotte would explain that little detail away. I stepped outside just as Charlotte reached my driveway, and let me tell you, she looked different today. Yesterday she'd been confident, professional, maybe a little flustered when things went wrong. Today she looked determined in a way that made me uncomfortable, like someone who'd been challenged and was ready to prove a point. "Good morning, Mr. Phillips," she said, and I realized I'd never actually told her my name. Red flag number 3, but who's counting? I've brought the backup master set today. We're going to resolve this lock situation once and for all. She held up that massive key ring like it was Excalibur or something. All those keys catching the morning sunlight, jingling together in a symphony of false authority. Betty walked over from her yard, and I could see other neighbors starting to emerge from their houses. Nothing draws a crowd like the promise of neighborhood drama. "Before we start," Betty said, and bless her heart for this, "maybe you could show us some official documentation. You know, just so we're all clear on the authority here." Charlotte's face tightened just a fraction, just enough to let me know Betty had hit a nerve. "Of course," Charlotte replied, pulling out her clipboard. "Standard homeowner notification process. Everything's properly documented." But when she handed the paperwork to Betty, I saw Betty's eyebrows go up. She showed me the form, and there it was, clear as day. The address was wrong. Not just wrong, but completely wrong. The form said 1247 Oakwood Drive. My address is 1274 Oak Ridge Drive. Different street name, different house number. When Betty pointed this out, Charlotte's reaction was, "Interesting." She grabbed the form back so fast she almost tore it. "That's an old template," she said quickly. "We're updating all the forms right now. I have the correct version in my car." But she didn't go to her car. Instead, she went straight to my door and started trying keys. And this, folks, is where things got really entertaining. Charlotte worked the lock like a magician, stalling for applause, key click, nothing. Another key, another stall. A bump try that rattled the rail. The crowd drifted closer. Betty raised her phone. Mrs. Clark's tea steamed in the morning air. She switched to pics. Tiny, hopeful clicks, then a hard bind, a rake, a thunk. My door stayed ajar. "Please stop," I said as evenly as I could. "That is my front door." She pretended not to hear tools skittering across the threshold, papers fanning out like white flags. The badge on her lanyard hung crooked. "This isn't consistent," she muttered. "These systems accept master patterns." She tested the latch, found the reinforced strike, and ran out of shortcuts. The semicircle of neighbors didn't see authority. They saw a bluff collapsing in real time. That's when she made the phone call. "Let me contact my supervisor," Charlotte announced, pulling out her phone. She put it on speaker, which in retrospect was a huge mistake on her part. The phone rang twice, then a man's voice answered. "Yeah, just yeah. Not city planning department or housing authority or any kind of professional greeting, just yeah." Charlotte didn't seem to notice how unprofessional this was. "It's me," she said. "I need you to bring the universal bypass sequence. The keys aren't working on this property." And the man's voice came back. "Which keys? How many have you tried?" And here's the thing that made Betty Wilson step forward with interest. The voice asked which keys and how many she'd tried. How would a supervisor know to ask that specific question unless he'd been watching? Unless he somehow already knew about the key failures? Betty looked at me, and I could see the same thought forming in her mind. This wasn't a supervisor call. This was coordination. "All of them," Charlotte replied into the phone. 15 keys and they're all wrong. This property has non-standard locks." The voice on the other end said, "Jake Sullivan here. I'm on my way with the emergency override kit. Keep trying." And then he hung up. Betty immediately started rewinding her phone video. "That voice," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've heard that voice before. That's the same man who was here last week claiming to be from the city water department." The crowd started murmuring and Charlotte's eyes went wide. She'd just made a massive mistake and everyone could see it. Her supervisor wasn't a supervisor at all. He was Jake Sullivan, the same guy who'd been running similar scams in our neighborhood for weeks. And Charlotte had just connected them publicly on speaker in front of 18 witnesses with cameras. The broken keys were still scattered across my doorstep, my lock was making weird clicking sounds, and Charlotte Williams was standing there looking like someone who'd just realized they'd walked into a trap of their own making. Phase 1, complete maybe. But Phase 2 was about to get a lot more complicated. Screen goes black. Audio only. Jake answering his phone. "Charlotte, how many keys failed?" And that's when I knew. Jake, someone who wasn't supposed to know about the key failures unless he'd been watching all along. 2 hours later, her sedan lurched to the curb, and the door thudded hard enough to rattle the mailbox. I was scraping the last bite of lunch from the plate when footsteps hit my walk in fast-clipped beats. The hardware on her lanyard chimed with each stride, sharp and insistent. Through my front window, I could see her marching up my walkway with a different clipboard, wearing what looked like a more official badge, and carrying what appeared to be some kind of legal document. The broken keys from this morning were still scattered around my doorstep, and my front door lock was still making that weird clicking sound every time the wind pushed the door frame. You'd think someone claiming to be a housing authority representative might be concerned about property damage they'd caused. You'd be wrong. "Mr. Phillips," Charlotte announced loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear, "this is an official emergency violation notice. You have 12 hours to bring this property into compliance, or the city will authorize emergency intervention." She thrust the document at me like she was serving a subpoena. Emergency intervention. I took the paper and immediately noticed two things. First, it looked extremely official. Proper letterhead, official seals, the whole 9 yards. Second, it was addressed to Tom Mitchell City Planning Emergency Division. Now I've lived in this city for 8 years, and I know most of the municipal departments. City planning doesn't have an emergency division. They barely have a regular division. But this document looked so authentic, so professional, that for a moment I found myself doubting my own knowledge. That's the thing about really good con artists. They make you question your own reality. Betty Wilson came out of her house, took one look at the situation, and walked straight over. "What's all this about emergency intervention?" she asked, reading over my shoulder. Charlotte launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about property compliance, safety violations, and municipal authority. But here's what caught my attention. She kept checking her watch, every 30 seconds, like she was on some kind of deadline herself. "The locksmith authorization has already been filed," Charlotte continued. "Team arrives at 7 a.m. tomorrow morning to override your security system, unless of course you'd prefer to resolve this matter through the standard penalty assessment process." Penalty assessment. That was a new one. Yesterday it was compliance checking, this morning it was master key access, and now we're talking about financial penalties and forced entry. The story kept changing, but Charlotte told each version with complete conviction. I pulled out my phone and immediately sent an email to the city planning office. Auto reply came back within seconds. Thank you for contacting city planning. Emergency processing requests are handled within 24 to 48 hours due to verification requirements. 24 to 48 hours. But Charlotte was demanding compliance in 12 hours. The math didn't work, and I said as much. That's exactly why we have emergency protocols, Charlotte replied smoothly. Standard bureaucratic delays don't apply when public safety is involved. She showed me what looked like a work order on her tablet. Official form signatures, the works. All for lock replacement at my address scheduled for 7 a.m. tomorrow morning. Emergency assessment fee is $2,847, she continued. Pay now and the emergency intervention is canceled. Wait until tomorrow and you're looking at forced entry plus all associated costs. Betty was busy on her own phone and I could see her pulling up information about Tom Mitchell. Interesting, Betty said after a few minutes. Tom Mitchell is a real person. He did work for city planning. Key word being did. According to the city website, he transferred to a different department 14 months ago. Charlotte's response was immediate and smooth. Temporary consulting arrangement. Very common for emergency situations. But I caught something in her voice. Just a slight tightness, like someone who'd prepared for this exact question. How do you prepare for that specific question? Unless you know your paperwork is going to be scrutinized. Unless you know you're using a real person's name inappropriately. Betty kept digging on her phone while Charlotte waited. You could see Charlotte getting more impatient, checking her watch more frequently, shifting her weight from foot to foot. That's when Charlotte made another tactical error. She pulled out her tablet to show us case studies of similar emergency interventions, and for just a moment the screen showed her email inbox. I'm pretty observant for an old guy, and I caught a glimpse of something interesting. Several emails from Courtney Management LLC. Why would someone from the city planning department be getting emails from a private management company? I didn't say anything at the time, but I filed that detail away for later. Charlotte quickly navigated away from her email, but the damage was done. Another piece of the puzzle was starting to fall into place. This wasn't city planning business. This was private business dressed up in official-looking paperwork. The question was, how many other people in how many other neighborhoods had fallen for this same routine? My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. Dad got your message about the neighbor situation. What's her exact full name? I can run some background checks from work. I texted back Charlotte Williams and briefly explained about the emergency intervention threat. Daniel's response came back fast. Dad, no legitimate city work happens without proper advance notice. I'm checking permits for your address right now. Document everything. That's when it hit me. I should be documenting everything. Photos of the paperwork, screenshots of the emails, recordings of conversations. If this was a scam, I needed evidence. If it wasn't a scam, well then I'd have documentation for my compliance. Either way, I'd be covered. I started taking pictures of Charlotte's emergency violation notice and she didn't object. In fact, she seemed pleased that I was taking it seriously. Another red flag. Legitimate officials usually explain procedures. They don't rely on intimidation and artificial urgency. So let me understand this correctly, I said, looking directly at Charlotte. You're telling me that if I don't pay $2,847 by tonight, a locksmith team will show up tomorrow morning and change my locks? She nodded confidently. Emergency municipal authority. It's all properly documented. But here's what bothered me. Why that specific amount? Government fees are usually round numbers, or at least explainable amounts based on actual costs. At $2,847. That sounded like someone had calculated exactly how much they thought they could extract from a retired engineer living alone. That sounded personal, not institutional. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was an unknown number with a text message. Your son won't always be on duty to help you. I stared at the message, feeling ice water in my veins. How did they know about Daniel? How did they know he was law enforcement? How did they know his duty schedule? I showed the message to Betty, and I could see her face change. This wasn't just about fake authority and fraudulent paperwork anymore. This was about surveillance. Someone had been watching my family, learning our patterns, gathering information for leverage. Charlotte was still talking about compliance deadlines and emergency interventions, but all I could think about was that text message. How do they know about Daniel, and are they tracking my son's duty schedule? The clock on my phone showed 6:30 p.m. According to Charlotte's ultimatum, I had 12 and a half hours to decide whether to pay nearly $3,000 or have my locks forcibly changed. But according to that anonymous text, I had even bigger problems than door locks to worry about. If you've ever had a stranger know too much about your family, share that feeling in the comments. Sometimes shared fear is what makes us stronger against people who prey on isolation. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every sound outside made me think someone was watching the house, monitoring our routines, planning their next move. By 5 a.m., I gave up on rest and made coffee instead. Strong coffee. The kind Margaret used to say could wake the dead. I needed clarity because in less than 2 hours, Charlotte's locksmith team was supposed to arrive and change my locks whether I wanted them to or not. The whole situation felt surreal, like I'd somehow stumbled into someone else's nightmare. But sitting there in my kitchen watching the sun come up over the neighborhood I'd called home for 8 years, I realized something important. This wasn't happening to someone else. This was happening to me, to us, to our community. And I wasn't going to let it continue without a fight. I spent the early morning doing what any retired engineer would do: research. If Charlotte Williams and Jake Sullivan were running some kind of systematic operation, there had to be traces of it somewhere. Social media accounts, business registrations, complaints filed with local authorities. What I found was disturbing. Charlotte's profile showed dozens of posts over the past 6 months, all about successful community consultations and helping neighbors maintain property values. The photos were always the same: her holding a clipboard, standing next to houses, sometimes with official-looking badges or documents. But here's what caught my attention. The houses were all in similar neighborhoods, all seemed to be owned by older residents, and the posts always used phrases like community compliance and property maintenance standards. This wasn't random. This was a targeted operation. Even more interesting were the comments on her posts. Several people had left angry messages about being scammed, about paying fees for services that never materialized, about having their property damaged during inspections. One comment particularly stood out. This woman and her partner Jake Sullivan took $4,000 from my elderly mother for emergency sewer compliance. City says no such work was ever authorized. Posted 3 weeks ago by someone in a neighborhood about 20 miles from here. So this wasn't Charlotte's first rodeo, and Jake Sullivan was definitely her partner, not her supervisor. They'd been working this scam for months, probably targeting widowers and elderly homeowners who lived alone. People like me who might be more likely to comply with official-sounding authority figures rather than cause trouble. At 6:30, my phone rang. Daniel. Dad, I've been up all night looking into this Charlotte Williams situation. We need to talk. His voice had that official tone he gets when he's working a case. I pulled permits for your address going back 2 years. No legitimate city work is scheduled, authorized, or even requested for your property. Whatever this woman is planning, it's not legal. He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. More importantly, I ran Charlotte Williams and Jake Sullivan through our database. They've been linked to at least 6 similar complaints across 3 counties. This is organized fraud, Dad. These people are professionals. That should have been reassuring, knowing that law enforcement was aware of the situation, that my son was working the case officially. Instead, it made me more worried. If they were experienced criminals, what would they do when their scam started falling apart? 20 minutes before the locksmith deadline, Charlotte showed up. But this time, she wasn't alone. Jake Sullivan was with her, a guy in his 40s wearing work clothes and carrying what looked like legitimate locksmith tools. More importantly, they had backup. 2 other men I didn't recognize, both wearing shirts that said Municipal Emergency Services and carrying clipboards. The whole operation looked official, professional, coordinated. If I hadn't spent the morning researching their background, I might have been intimidated. Instead, I was angry. These people had been terrorizing my neighborhood for months, targeting vulnerable residents, destroying property, and collecting money for services they never intended to provide. Margaret always taught me that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. This was one of those times. I stepped outside to meet them, my phone already recording video. "Good morning," I said loud enough for Betty and the other neighbors to hear. "I understand you're here to change my locks without my permission." Charlotte started into her prepared speech about municipal authority and emergency compliance, but I cut her off. "Before you touch my property, I'd like to see proper identification and documentation. Real identification, not the fake badges and forged paperwork you've been using." Jake Sullivan looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight and glancing at Charlotte like he was waiting for instructions. The two backup guys were trying to look official, but I could see them checking their phones and looking around nervously. This wasn't how their usual routine was supposed to go. "Mr. Phillips," Charlotte said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use when they think you're being unreasonable. "We've been through all this yesterday. The documentation is complete, the authority is clear, and the deadline has passed. We're proceeding with emergency intervention." She nodded to Jake, who stepped forward with his toolbox. But that's when something interesting happened. Betty Wilson came out of her house with her phone already filming. Then Mrs. Clark appeared with her phone. Then Mr. Garcia. Within 2 minutes, we had 8 neighbors standing in a semicircle, all recording video. Charlotte and Jake were now facing a very public audience, and their confidence started to waver. "Ma'am," Betty said, addressing Charlotte directly, "could you please explain why your inspection report yesterday showed the wrong address, and why your emergency violation notice was signed by someone who hasn't worked for the city in over a year?" Jake was the first one to crack. He looked at the crowd, looked at Charlotte, then looked at his toolbox. "Lady," he said under his breath, "your work order number does not exist in the city system, and the permit ID on this printout points to a sidewalk repair across town last year." He tapped the barcode with a gloved finger and held it up to his phone. The lookup returned nothing. Charlotte flushed and told him to proceed anyway. He stared at the crowd, then at the bogus document, then clicked his toolbox shut. "I am not touching a cylinder on a bad ticket while half the block is recording," he said. But instead of bolting, he pulled out his phone and dialed someone pacing in a tight line near the truck. The 2 men in matching shirts didn't flee. They drifted to the shade and pretended to review forms, trading low whispers, while their eyes kept jumping to Betty's camera. Charlotte hovered between them, and my porch voice pitched low and urgent. "You'll be indemnified," she said. "This is authorized." Her words bounced off faces that were done being impressed. One of the men snapped a photo of the printout and texted it to a number he said was his dispatcher. He got a reply he didn't read out loud. "You have 15 minutes, Charlotte told them, then glanced at her watch as if a countdown could conjure legitimacy. No one moved. Engines stayed off. The scene didn't resolve. It stalled an awkward stalemate instead of a getaway. Whatever retreat they were planning, they saved it for another day. Charlotte stood there for another few minutes trying to salvage some dignity from the situation. She took photos of my house, muttered about filing additional violations, and made vague threats about escalating the matter to higher authorities. But the fight had gone out of her. Her backup had abandoned her, her cover story was blown, and she had 8 neighbors with video evidence of attempted fraud. As she walked back to her car, I heard her make a phone call. "It didn't work," she said. "The target has too much community support. We need to move to Plan B." Plan B. What the hell was Plan B? My iPad screen shows Target Charles Phillips, Phase 2 isolation complete, and scrolling down reveals next target Betty Wilson, 1276 Oak Ridge Drive. Betty, the one person who'd been helping me fight this scam, was next on their list. Tomorrow morning, locksmith team will be here at 7, unless something changes tonight. By 6 p.m. that evening, Betty Wilson had organized something I'd never seen before in our quiet neighborhood, an emergency community meeting. 12 neighbors packed into her living room, and the energy was electric. Not the good kind of electric, the kind that comes when people realize they've been targeted by predators operating right under their noses. You can't just change someone's locks. That was Mrs. Clark already mid-argument when I walked in. Charlotte was sitting in the center of the room like she was holding court clipboard on her lap, that fake badge still hanging around her neck. But tonight was different. Tonight she was facing a room full of angry neighbors who'd done their homework. Betty had spent the afternoon making phone calls, and what she'd discovered was disturbing. 3 other families on our street had received similar compliance notifications over the past 2 months. The Garcias had paid $600 for a drainage assessment that never happened. Mrs. Patterson down the block had been charged $450 for tree compliance monitoring that consisted of Jake Sullivan taking photos of her oak tree and leaving. And the elderly couple at the end of the street, the Johnsons, had paid over $1,200 for foundation stability consultation that turned out to be Jake measuring their front walkway with a tape measure. All official-looking paperwork, all signed by people who didn't work for the city, all money that went to companies that didn't exist. The pattern was clear, and it was sickening. "Show us where these emergency fees actually go," Betty said, still recording. Charlotte delivered the same polished answer about professional channels and proper tracking. Betty reached into a manila envelope and slid a printed bank registry across the coffee table, the columns neat and brutal. The routing number on the invoices matched deposits into an account labeled Courtney Management LLC. Dates lined up to the week neighbors had paid. The room went quiet in a way that made the air feel heavy. 12 neighbors staring at Charlotte's phone screen, seeing proof that community fees were going into a private company account. Not city planning, not municipal services, not community improvement. A private LLC that none of us had ever heard of. Charlotte quickly turned her phone face down, but the damage was done. "Community fund," Mr. Garcia asked, his voice getting louder. "That money is going to your personal business account." Charlotte tried to maintain her composure, but you could see the panic setting in. Courtney Management LLC is a professional property management company contracted by the city for specialized services. This is standard procedure for emergency interventions. Standard procedure. I'd spent 30 years as an engineer working with municipal contracts, and nothing about this was standard. Government payments don't go to private LLCs without extensive documentation, competitive bidding, and public oversight. What Charlotte was describing was either completely fraudulent or so far outside normal procedures that it might as well be fraud. That's when Charlotte made her biggest mistake of the evening. She was trying to play some kind of training audio on her phone, probably something about municipal authority or emergency procedures. But instead of starting from the beginning, the audio picked up mid-sentence. "Remember backdate, all violations for maximum compliance impact. The older the violation appears, the more urgent the compliance seems." She frantically hit the stop button, but everyone had heard it. "Training materials," she said quickly, taken completely out of context. But Betty was already playing back her own recording from yesterday's confrontation. Jake Sullivan's voice clear as day, admitting that he was using the wrong house address, but proceeding with property damage anyway. The same voice that had answered Charlotte's supervisor called the same voice that had just told people to backdate violations for psychological manipulation. The room erupted. 12 people all talking at once, demanding explanations, sharing their own stories of being scammed, comparing the official-looking documents they'd been shown. Charlotte tried to regain control of the situation, standing up with her clipboard and raising her voice. "These are complex municipal procedures that require specialized understanding. I'm trying to help this community maintain property values and legal compliance." But nobody was buying it anymore. The facade had completely crumbled. Mrs. Clark held up her phone, showing Charlotte's social media posts from other neighborhoods, other elderly victims, other successful compliance consultations that were obviously part of the same scam operation. I chose that moment to text Daniel. "Meeting exposed possible fraud, LLC payments, multiple neighborhood victims. This is bigger than we thought." His response came back immediately. "Dad, I'm officially escalating this case. We're building a comprehensive investigation. Don't confront her directly tonight. Let the system work. Help is coming." Help was coming. That should have been reassuring. But looking around Betty's living room at my neighbors, good people who'd been systematically targeted and robbed by professionals, I realized the help should have come months ago. How many other neighborhoods were dealing with Charlotte and Jake? How many other elderly residents had paid money they couldn't afford for services that never existed? How many communities had been victimized while these two perfected their operation? Charlotte's phone rang and she answered it without thinking. "What?" She snapped, clearly frustrated with how the meeting was going. The caller's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Charlotte, how many of them know about the LLC payments?" It was Jake Sullivan, and he'd just confirmed in front of 12 witnesses that they were coordinating this scam operation together. Charlotte realized her mistake immediately and hung up, but the call had lasted long enough for everyone to understand exactly what was happening. This wasn't miscommunication or bureaucratic confusion. This was organized fraud, and we'd just witnessed the criminals coordinating their story in real time. Betty looked around the room at all of us, then back at Charlotte. "I'm going to ask this one more time, and I want everyone to hear the answer clearly. Who here has paid money to Courtney Management LLC for any kind of community services?" The response was devastating. 5 hands went up slowly. Mrs. Clark, $400. The Garcias, $600. Mrs. Patterson, $450. The Johnsons, $1,200. And Mr. Williams from 2 streets over, who'd apparently been charged $800 for electrical compliance monitoring that never happened. Over $3,400 just from the people in Betty's living room. How much more from victims who weren't at the meeting? How much more from neighborhoods we didn't know about? That's when Betty's phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Courtney Management LLC. Betty looked at the phone, looked at Charlotte, then held the phone up for everyone to see. Charlotte's eyes went wide with panic. She'd forgotten that her business phone was set to call back automatically after interrupted calls. She was about to get a call from her own company in front of 12 witnesses, who now knew exactly what Courtney Management LLC was. Betty answered the call and put it on speaker. "Hello, this is Courtney Management." Charlotte's own voice came through the speaker. She'd just called herself, proving beyond any doubt that she was running the entire operation. The room fell silent except for the sound of Charlotte Williams realizing that she'd just exposed herself completely in front of people with cameras in a way that no amount of official-looking paperwork could ever explain away. The next morning brought what I can only describe as the most surreal confrontation of my 65 years on this planet. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when I heard them coming. Not just Charlotte this time, but a whole parade of fake authority. Charlotte with her massive keyring, Jake Sullivan with a different set of locksmith tools, and two new guys wearing shirts that said, "Emergency Municipal Response Team." The four of them marched up my driveway like they were staging some kind of official intervention. But here's what they hadn't counted on. Word had spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By the time Charlotte reached my front door, 18 neighbors had gathered in a semicircle on my lawn, and every single one of them had their phone out recording video. "Mr. Phillips," Charlotte called out, projecting like a presenter at a trade show, "we're here to complete a documented site verification." She didn't say emergency this time, she said documented, then lifted a stack of glossy forms that looked fresh from a printer. She fanned them for the cameras and pointed to bold section headers, as if fonts could stand in for authority. She raised a keyring big enough to anchor a skiff metals clanging in a cold chain on concrete scrape that ran along the siding. The sound didn't sell confidence, it sold nerves. Her eyes kept cutting to the phones, to Betty's live counter, to the neighbors shoulder to shoulder on my lawn. Whatever script she'd rehearsed, the audience had changed it. Betty Wilson stepped forward from the crowd, her phone held high, live streaming everything to social media. "Before you start," Betty announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want everyone to know that this live stream currently has 847 viewers watching. People from across the city are seeing this right now." 847 people. I had no idea Betty's social media had that kind of reach. But Charlotte's face went pale when she heard the number. Whatever she'd been planning to do, she hadn't expected a live audience of nearly 1,000 people. Jake Sullivan looked around at all the cameras and started backing toward his truck. "Maybe we should reschedule this," he muttered. But Charlotte grabbed his arm. "No!" she hissed loud enough for the crowd to hear. "We finish this today." What happened next wasn't locksmithing anymore. It was a public cross-exam. Charlotte planted herself on my porch and tried to turn posture into power. She flashed a laminated notice, waved a clipboard like it was a badge, and started reciting ordinance numbers that didn't match any code Mr. Garcia could pull up on his phone. Betty angled her live stream so the comments filled the screen: contractors, city clerks, a retired inspector, people chiming in with line-by-line corrections. A neighbor called out, "What department code is that exactly?" Charlotte pretended not to hear, tugged a bright strip that said "property sealed" from her kit, and pressed it to my frame as if tape could invent jurisdiction. I stepped forward so she could see my camera and the semicircle of phones behind me. She froze halfway through the motion, then switched tactics. She held up a work order and read fast, skipping the parts that would have listed a routing path or a permit index. Jake hovered at the curb, suddenly very interested in the texture of his toolbox. Mrs. Clark asked for the city callback number that should appear on every urgent notice. Charlotte offered a generic line that led to a voicemail tree. The live stream chat posted the real number off the .gov site and dared her to let us call it. She tried to recover with a speech about safety compliance and community standards. The comments hammered back with citations and screenshots. Her seal peeled at the edge and drooped a little flag of make-believe surrender. The only thing moving was the chat counter climbing past 800. My door did what doors do when paperwork is pretend it stayed closed. That's when the live stream comments started getting really interesting. Betty held up her phone so we could all see the screen, and the comments were flooding in faster than we could read them. "We know this woman. She tried the same thing on Maple Street. That's my ex-wife. She has a restraining order. Call the police, this is fraud." But the comment that made everyone stop and stare was from someone with the username Restaurant Family 2019. "That woman Charlotte Williams owes us $4,000 for fake health department violations. She's been banned from our county." A restraining order. Health department scams. How many different kinds of fraud was this woman running, and how many communities had she victimized before working her way to our neighborhood? Charlotte finally stood up, her professional outfit now dirty and disheveled keys scattered across my doorstep like confetti at a very sad party. She looked at the crowd of 18 neighbors, at the 847 people watching online, at the evidence of her complete failure spread out on the ground around her. "The lock mechanism has been tampered with," she announced, trying one last time to sound official. "This property is in violation of municipal access requirements." But nobody was buying it anymore. Mrs. Clark stepped forward from the crowd. "Ma'am, we've all been researching you online. We know about the other neighborhoods, the fake company, and the elderly people you've been scamming. The police are already investigating." "Police?" I looked around for Daniel's patrol car but didn't see it. Mrs. Clark caught my expression and smiled. "Oh, we didn't wait for your son, Mr. Phillips. Betty called 911 20 minutes ago." That's when Charlotte made her final desperate mistake. She looked at all those cameras, at all those people recording her humiliation, and she snapped. "Turn those phones off," she screamed. "Delete everything. You can't record municipal proceedings without authorization." She actually lunged for Betty's phone, trying to grab it, trying to stop the live stream that was broadcasting her breakdown to hundreds of people across the city. Jake Sullivan saw her losing control and made his choice. He jumped in his truck and drove off, leaving Charlotte alone to face the consequences of their months-long scam operation. The two fake emergency municipal response guys followed Jake's lead and disappeared so fast they left tire marks on my driveway. Charlotte stood there alone, surrounded by broken keys, facing 18 angry neighbors and an online audience that was now approaching 1,000 viewers. The comments kept coming. "Someone call her probation officer. This is evidence for our court case. She owes my grandmother money too. How many people had this woman hurt? How many communities had she terrorized with fake authority and manufactured emergencies?" Betty's live stream was becoming an impromptu victim support group, with people sharing their stories and connecting with others who'd been scammed by the same operation. Charlotte Williams thought she was running a local hustle, targeting isolated elderly residents. What she'd actually done was create a digital paper trail that connected dozens of victims across multiple counties, all recorded in real time, all admissible in court. If you've ever seen someone suspicious in your neighborhood, do you report it online? Share your experience. Community warning systems are our real defense against people who prey on isolation and fake authority. What Charlotte Williams did next will haunt me for the rest of my life, not because it was violent or dangerous, but because it showed just how far someone will go when their entire world is collapsing around them. Standing there on my doorstep, surrounded by broken keys and 18 witnesses with cameras, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Not to report her own criminal activity, not to turn herself in, but to make what I can only describe as the most audacious false police report I've ever witnessed. She put the call on speaker either by accident or because she wanted everyone to hear her regain control of the situation. Big mistake. 911, what's your emergency? Came the calm, professional voice of the dispatcher. Charlotte immediately launched into a performance that would have been Oscar-worthy if it hadn't been completely fabricated. Emergency? I need a police response to 1274 Oak Ridge Drive. The elderly resident has barricaded himself inside with illegally modified security systems. Community safety is being threatened. Barricaded myself, I was standing right next to her on my own front porch. The resident has been hostile to city officials for days and is now preventing emergency municipal access. I have 20 witnesses to his non-compliance with lawful authority. The dispatcher asked for more details, and Charlotte really went all out. Sir, this man has been threatening city workers, damaging municipal property, and refusing to cooperate with legally mandated safety inspections. We need immediate law enforcement intervention. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everything she said was not just wrong, it was the complete opposite of what had actually happened. She was the one who had damaged my property, broken multiple keys in my lock, and tried to extort money from me and my neighbors. But here she was telling a 911 dispatcher that I was the aggressor, that I was threatening people, that I was some kind of danger to the community. The 18 neighbors standing around us were as shocked as I was. Betty held up her phone to make sure the live stream was capturing Charlotte's false police report, and the online comments were exploding with outrage. People who'd been following our situation for the past hour were watching Charlotte try to weaponize law enforcement against her own victim. The dispatcher was asking for Charlotte's name and credentials when we heard the sirens. Not one police car, two. The first one came around the corner, fast lights flashing, followed by a second unit about 30 seconds later. Standard procedure for emergency calls involving potential violence or public safety threats. My heart was pounding, not from fear of the police, but from the realization that Charlotte had just escalated this situation to a level that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. False police reports are felonies. Filing false emergency calls is a felony. What Charlotte had just done in front of witnesses on camera was going to land her in prison. She just didn't know it yet. The first patrol car pulled into my driveway and I recognized the vehicle immediately. Daniel. My son was responding to a 911 call about his own father. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. Daniel got out of his car in full sheriff's uniform, looking every inch the professional law enforcement officer he'd become. He was followed by a backup officer I didn't recognize, a younger guy who looked like he was taking this call very seriously. Daniel approached the crowd with his hands visible, his body language calm but alert, exactly like they teach in police training. "Good evening," he said, addressing the entire group. "I'm Sheriff Phillips, responding to an emergency call about a disturbance at this address." Charlotte's face lit up with relief. Finally, someone with real authority had arrived to sort out this mess. "Officer," she said, rushing toward Daniel with her clipboard, "thank goodness you're here. This man has been interfering with municipal operations and threatening city workers. I'm Charlotte Williams, authorized representative of the Municipal Planning Department." She thrust her fake paperwork at Daniel, who accepted it with the kind of professional courtesy that cops show everyone, even obvious criminals. Daniel examined the documents carefully, his expression neutral, giving no indication that he was looking at forged city letterheads and fabricated authority. "Ma'am, this letterhead appears to be forged," Daniel said quietly. "Tom Mitchell retired from city planning 14 months ago, and this department code doesn't exist in our municipal system." That's when Charlotte made the mistake that sealed her fate forever. Instead of trying to explain the paperwork, instead of backing down, instead of accepting that her scam had run its course, she went on the attack. "You're protecting your father," she screamed loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "This is corruption police protecting criminals." The backup officer immediately stepped forward, hand moving instinctively toward his radio. But Daniel remained calm, professional, completely by the book. "Ma'am," he said in that steady cop voice, "you just identified our relationship. I had not disclosed that information. How did you know he was my father?" The question sat there and no one rushed to fill it. Color drained from her face and then came back in blotches. She started a sentence twice and abandoned it both times. Daniel tapped his body camera and spoke for the record. "I am preserving potential evidence related to false reports and organized fraud. Do you consent to a forensic review of your devices?" Charlotte stared down at her phone, and her thumb moved in quick little arcs. A neighbor gasped. "Remote wipe," Betty said softly. Daniel slipped a small silver bag from his vest and dropped the phone inside before it could finish whatever command she had started. The backup officer stepped in. "Hands, please." She looked from the sealed bag to the circle of cameras and let her hands rise. "You have the right to remain silent," Daniel began, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Finally, after months of terrorizing elderly residents, after stealing thousands of dollars through fake authority and forged paperwork, after damaging property and filing false police reports, Charlotte Williams was arrested. But the story wasn't over yet. Daniel's radio crackled with a message from dispatch. "Unit 47, we have warrants ready for Charlotte Williams and Jake Sullivan. Multiple charges across 3 counties. Warrants plural. They'd been building a case against both of them probably for weeks. My son hadn't just happened to respond to Charlotte's 911 call. Law enforcement had been tracking this operation, building evidence, waiting for the right moment to make arrests that would stick. Charlotte had just provided that moment by filing a false emergency report in front of 20 witnesses with cameras. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Charlotte's wrists, her massive key ring finally went silent. After days of rattling like a percussion instrument announcing her presence, intimidating residents with the sound of false authority, those keys were finally quiet. The crowd of neighbors broke into applause. The live stream comments were celebrating, and Charlotte Williams was learning that real authority doesn't come from fake badges and forged paperwork. Real authority comes from the law, from proper procedures, from people who took an oath to protect and serve their communities. And sometimes real authority looks like your son doing his job, even when that job means arresting someone who tried to scam his father. 3 months later, I was reading the local newspaper over morning coffee when I saw the headline, "Local Fraud Ring Sentenced After Targeting Elderly Residents." There was Charlotte Williams in her booking photo, looking nothing like the confident authority figure who'd first appeared on my doorstep with her master keys and fake badge. The article detailed everything: the systematic targeting of widowed homeowners, the forged municipal documents, the fake company that had collected over $47,000 from victims across 3 counties. $47,000. That's how much money Charlotte and Jake had stolen from people like me, like my neighbors, like elderly residents who just wanted to maintain their homes in peace. The forensic investigation of Charlotte's devices had revealed everything. Her phone contained backdated violation records proving she'd been manufacturing compliance issues to create artificial urgency. Her tablet had detailed profiles of potential victims, including notes about their age, living situations, and estimated financial resources. Most disturbing of all, her social media accounts contained screenshots and photos from dozens of neighborhoods with comments about which residents seemed most likely to pay fees without questioning authority. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was predatory targeting of vulnerable populations planned and executed with military precision. The legal consequences actually matched the damage. Charlotte took a felony plea on organized fraud and filing a false emergency report, plus 2 misdemeanors for impersonating a public official. The judge imposed a suspended state term with 90 days in county custody, 5 years probation with search terms, and a no-contact order protecting every named victim. Restitution wasn't a headline number. It was a payment plan the clerk will enforce until the last dollar is repaid with treble penalties if she defaults. She's barred from property management inspections and door-to-door solicitations for 5 years after probation ends. Family court saw the same footage everyone else did. The judge limited contact to supervised visits until further order. Jake Sullivan's cooperation with law enforcement had helped identify 2 other accomplices operating similar scams in neighboring counties. His full confession revealed the scope of their operation: systematic fraud targeting over 60 families across a 2-year period. The training audio Charlotte had accidentally played during our community meeting turned out to be part of a comprehensive manual they'd developed for recruiting new scammers and expanding their operation. Law enforcement used Jake's information to break up an entire network of fake authority scams that had been plaguing communities throughout our region. 3 other people were arrested, and investigations were launched in 7 additional counties where similar complaints had been filed. The community healing process was remarkable to witness. Within a week of Charlotte's arrest, Betty Wilson had organized a neighborhood potluck with a banner that read, "BYO Master Keys." The humor helped everyone process what we'd been through together. But more importantly, Betty established herself as our unofficial neighborhood coordinator, organizing monthly meetings where residents could share concerns and verify any official-looking communications they received. We learned to ask for proper identification, to verify authority through official channels, and most importantly, to support each other when something seemed suspicious. The experience had taught us that community solidarity is our best defense against people who prey on isolation and artificial authority. The broader impact extended far beyond our neighborhood. Local news coverage of Charlotte's arrest and the live stream footage sparked discussions about elder fraud protection across the entire city. The municipal planning department implemented new verification procedures requiring official advance notice for any property inspections with mandatory confirmation calls to residents before any work begins. Neighboring towns established alert systems to warn communities about suspected fraud operations, and the county launched a special task force focused specifically on crimes targeting elderly residents. Charlotte Williams thought she was running a simple local hustle. Instead, she'd catalyze systemic improvements in fraud prevention across our entire region. My memorial garden for Margaret had been expanded with donations from neighbors who wanted to help repair the damage Jake Sullivan had caused to my sprinkler system. But it became something more than that. A community gathering space where people could connect with each other and share information about neighborhood safety. Betty organized Verify Before You Trust workshops in the garden, teaching residents how to research official-sounding claims and report suspicious activities. The roses Margaret had loved were now surrounded by flowers contributed by families throughout the neighborhood, creating something beautiful from what had started as a criminal violation of our community. 6 months after Charlotte's arrest, a new family moved in down the street. The wife knocked on my door to introduce herself and asked the question I'd been expecting. "Is there a homeowners association here?" I smiled, watching Betty watering the expanded memorial garden, thinking about everything our community had learned about real authority versus fake authority. "Just neighbors who take care of each other," I told her. "And we've learned to verify everything before we trust anyone claiming to have master keys to our lives." Betty looked over from the garden and added, "Real authority doesn't need to intimidate people or demand immediate payment. Real authority explains procedures, provides proper documentation, and respects the people it serves." The new neighbor smiled and thanked us for the information. As she walked away, I noticed something on my doorstep, a certified letter that had arrived while we were talking. The return address made my blood run cold. Charlotte Williams, State Correctional Facility. I stared at the envelope, hearing that familiar sound of keys rattling in my memory. Some stories, it seems, don't end just because justice has been served. They evolve, they continue, they find new chapters when you least expect them. Maybe our story with Charlotte Williams wasn't quite finished after all.